Hello and welcome to an exclusive masterclass with E-FWD with Annabelle and Becky from ThinkPR.
We're going to be discussing balancing company tone of voice with personal branding.
What are the best ways to get your voice heard when looking to build your personal brand?
So a good place to start is definitely social media. It's a free platform to use. You've got kind of creative control there of what you can say, but then you can open that up wider, look at events, wherever your target audience is. You've got, technical articles, thought leadership. There's so many different ways to do it.
And I think that's the thing when we are helping our clients, it's forgotten kind of that it's part of the marketing strategy. So creating your personal brand goes hand in hand with developing your profile of your company. And within that, there's lots of different tools you can use. So although we are very focused on LinkedIn within the energy sector, I think there's so many other ways that you can use, like you say, events, thought leadership, abstracts, speaking opportunities, etc. It all goes to developing your personal brand.
Yeah, and I think as well, personal brand, I think people sometimes forget it is personal. So it's you and who you actually are. So, you're not creating something necessarily, you're just kind of voicing your thoughts and feelings as well. So it needs to be authentic and organic. I think it's quite noticeable when it's not.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about it later on, but how it aligns with your company messaging and values as well. Are there tactics for changing your personal brand within a company?
That's quite an interesting one because I feel like I've done that to an extent. So my background is predominantly graphic design, brand identity creation, but I love marketing and messaging, PR. So when I kind of started transitioning into that, it was quite difficult, I think, at first to not pigeonhole myself as a designer and kind of open that up a little bit. In terms of tactics, I think it's just being aware of what you're kind of talking about when you're speaking to people. I still do it, automatically lean into talking about how brands look visually, but really, it's changing how you kind of lead that messaging.
I think for kind of senior leaders as well, I think it's a really good point because as you evolve in your role and you're trying to lead a company potentially through acquisition or an exit strategy, I think it's really important that your personal brand kind of aligns with what the company's doing as well. So very often we have business leaders that need to adapt their personal brand so that they are more attractive to private equity, for investment, because they have to adapt and evolve as the business grows as well to align with the business strategy. So I think from a personal aspect, it's kind of, you don't want to get pigeonholed into a specific role as you grow and develop in your career, but also from a company perspective, it's making sure that your kind of brand and the company's brand aligns with what you need to do as a business as well.
I think that's quite interesting as well because we've worked with clients before that have gone through that acquisition process and they've had a very specific personality type that I've noticed other people try to then replicate, but because it's not them as a person, it doesn't quite work.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think it comes back again to being authentic and, the company that you've built is a reflection of you as well. So people are going to buy into that. What are the key things I should do to define my personal brand?
I think it's, again, really important to remember that there's that crossover between personal brand and your company brand. So you have to have some alignment with what you're doing in terms of the company values. I think being authentic is so important. We talk about this a lot. Building that trust, building that respect, being a thought leader in your field. We always talk about coming across as the kind of expert opinion, and that's very valuable when it comes to creating your brand for both your business and your personal brand. We've worked with business leaders that have never used any sort of social media, and it can be very overwhelming. But we've also worked with business leaders who are fantastic at creating their own personal brand. They've got their own style, they've got their own kind of vision for it. Tristan from Delta Tech, which was acquired by Expro last year, I think that's a really interesting, his storytelling is so unique and so fantastic about the innovation and technology of the company, and he very much drove that narrative. And that came from him. It was so authentic. And I think it's getting that balance when you do have somebody that's slightly more uncomfortable with it and how you kind of develop that personal brand and what you do as well. But it's something that's so important. It's so important for recruitment. It's so important for building a business, developing that kind of exit strategy as well. And I think it's how we kind of develop that without it being too kind of curated and it needs to be authentic.
Yeah. No, I would absolutely agree. And we've had people use him as an example of how they want to present themselves, which I always find really interesting because that just is how he is as a person. And he was able to tie that in. And I think that's a really important message. How do you ensure that your team are representing their organization's goals and values whilst they're building their own personal brand?
So as a business leader, I think it's really important you communicate what the values are for a start. Yes. And again, we've worked with businesses that have no idea. It's like, let's develop those from the beginning. And then being very clear how you communicate those values and communicate the messaging about what the company stands for and what you as a business leader stand for as well. Because the two go hand in hand. And I think, I've had ThinkPR now, for 20 years, and my own personal brand has developed and evolved, and that's a very natural thing, and it has to as a business owner. But it's how I lead the company and lead the team, and obviously what we do is very much within the marketing and personal brand area. But for me personally, the work that we do out within the third sector, charity work, etc., that's very personal to me, but it also then communicates to the team. So I think ensuring that, we're very clear of how we, and businesses need to be doing this, is internal comms issue. It's how we kind of develop those messages and how we kind of communicate what we stand for as a company, and companies need to be able to do that, and business leaders need to be able to do that as well.
Yeah. I think on the flip side, as an employee, that openness with your values is really important. So when we first started working with our charity partner A&D, that made me then feel comfortable enough to sort of say to the team, do you know, actually I'm neurodivergent as well, which I hadn't really voiced before. So I think that's so important when you're trying to get your team to build their personal brand, is you have to create that space for them to do it. And if it's too, rigid or structured, or they're confused, it's just not going to work, because they won't know what they can and can't say.
And I think it can be really overwhelming with the platforms that we have available to build your personal brand. As you know, it's, when I get told I have to do TikToks because that's one audience, LinkedIn for another audience, Instagram, there's so many tools and so many platforms, and you have to adapt the messaging for each one as well.
Yeah.
So I think, when we're talking about TikTok and how we've created our narrative on that platform, and that's obviously helped with our recruitment, and it's helped with a different audience, what we communicate through LinkedIn about our client work, about our energy and our expertise, that's going to be very different to what we kind of communicate on a platform such as TikTok. So it's kind of coming back a step and not getting too overwhelmed by all these different tools available to you as well.
And I think naturally there's always going to be some tools that sit better with you than others. And I do think it's important to recognise that as well. And then kind of relying on your team to fill in the gaps where maybe it's not fitting right with you.
And not being afraid to get support from expertise as well. Obviously that's why we do what we do, because we are the experts. But also, business leaders sometimes literally sit across the table and say, well, they have no idea where to start. And it's supporting them in that process as well, which can be quite daunting too.
Yeah. And I think sometimes even just having that awareness of what's available to you, which is some of the conversations we'll have with our clients, they don't even know what's out there to use. And it's not to say that they don't know how to do it, they just don't even know it exists. So having that third party support there is really important. What steps can I take to encourage my team to see personal branding as an opportunity for growth rather than self-promotion?
I think that's always the fear, that you're being too out there with your own brand, and it's almost like self-promotion. And I think it's a really important kind of balance to get as well. I think for many people, it's not just talking about what you've achieved at this present time, it's looking back at your legacy and kind of talking about how you got to where you are. There's been so many experiences of businesses that have grown and gone through huge transition and changes, and the business leaders that are involved in that are truly inspirational. And I think understanding that journey of what they've been through is so compelling to listen to. And I think people forget that. So I think kind of going back to the history of what you've done in your career, whether you've just started out, whether it's kind of how you've developed your career and changed paths, etc. And I think we saw that in Women New Energy. There's been so many different career paths that women have taken to get where they are, in senior roles as well. So I think that's all part of your personal brand, and it's really important to remember that you're kind of talking to your peers, you're talking to your colleagues as well. On that note, I think engaging with your peers and your colleagues, so that you're not just talking about yourself, but you're actually getting involved in different conversations, for instance, on LinkedIn, appearing genuine, in terms of interest of other people. I think that's a really nice, authentic part of your personal brand as well.
Definitely. And I think leading by example. So if you've got junior team members, they maybe don't know how to position themselves in terms of personal brand, but if they've got you to look up to see how you're approaching it, then, they can then pick up on that as well.
Yeah. How can we create a sense of personal investment in the brand among employees to improve engagement and advocacy?
So this is really interesting, actually, because when we did our roundtables at Women in New Energy, this was a really big topic of conversation at my table. People were kind of saying how their companies, they didn't really feel aligned necessarily with the company that they worked for in terms of the messaging. And a lot of that came down to culture and culture nuances and understanding those barriers there. So they were being told, you have to speak in a certain tone of voice, you have to use certain language, but that didn't align with how they worked as, people from the various regions they were from. So I think when you are running a business, if you are international, you need to have that awareness of how people interact and how people speak, and that's how you're going to align with your team, and they're going to buy into it then, because if they don't feel that that's natural to them, it's not going to align ever.
Yeah, and we're working in a global industry, so it's such an important part of adapting to each region. And we always talk about tailoring the messages to each region as well, to make sure that we are very much focused on the different audiences that our clients are working with as well.
Yeah, well, it's that local content, isn't it? Even down to how you communicate with your clients. If you can communicate in a way that they respond well to, because it's how they're also communicating, that can only be positive.
Mm-hmm. Not just clients as well, it's recruitment.
Exactly.
So a huge part of creating your brand and developing your brand as a company, it's about attracting the right talent as well. So I think local content, that's so important. What strategies can help us tell a compelling story about a transformation and future impact?
So I think a solid foundation is always really important. So that is your company branding, your messaging, your core values, as we've already spoken about, and working with someone who actually understands that process, that will help you get the best outcome. So it's not just about putting something that looks nice as a logo and then you're done. It's everything that comes behind it. So your tone of voice, just absolutely everything that kind of builds that foundation. And then that's a good platform to then start from. And if you're looking at kind of, pre-commercialization of technology, or you're doing trials and things, you need that brand awareness then to build on. And I think that's a really important part of it.
Again, what about if you've already got an established brand, but you want to adapt it maybe to a changing market, if you're diversifying, or you're perhaps, again, going into a different region and you need to adapt that brand. So almost like a brand refresh rather than a whole brand development.
Yeah.
So again, that's something that's worth considering. It doesn't have to be a complete change in direction. Maybe just a tweak to the brand is also helpful too, which again, we've obviously supported with.
Yeah, we've done that quite a few times actually. And a brand refresh can be anything from, updating your color palette right through to just tweaking a couple of your core values. So it was really an open-ended process, kind of. It's constantly evolving. I guess everyone's kind of always refreshing their brand to an extent. And I think that is really important, especially if you're moving into new markets, new regions, or if you're even kind of doing a recruitment drive. I think just having awareness of the brand that you're presenting is really important.
And the energy transition is such a huge focus as well, and how we are communicating what our clients do within the energy transition. And sometimes that needs to be reflected in the brand as well.
Yes, and I think when the energy transition first started coming about, you'll notice a lot of brands just went green, like literally just put green in their logo, and I would say don't do that. Branding, even down to colours, it might not seem like a big deal to everyone, but eventually people started cottoning on to greenwashing.
Yeah.
So you have to be really aware when you are making these changes and make sure you're evolving and future-proofing your company as well. You don't want to do something you're going to have to then change again in a year's time. If it's as big as changing your logo or your colours or something, it needs to align with where you're going as a company and also have a purpose behind it as well.
Mm-hmm.
How can I position myself as a thought leader or go-to expert in my fields?
I think within our industry that we work in as an energy-focused marketing firm, that's such an important part of what we do. So we're dealing with lots of different businesses throughout the globe, and there's very much key events and opportunities to put that thought leadership across. And we talk about becoming kind of across as a expert opinion, an expert voice in our fields. And for our clients that we work with, that's a really, really big part of the marketing strategy. So thought leadership, technical articles, expertise within key media. Obviously, media want to have that expert opinions, talking about technology, talking about business growth, talking about challenges and opportunities within the market. Within the event side as well, the conferences that we work amongst, it's obviously very important to get across speaking opportunities. We talk about panel speaking, keynote addresses, etc. And I think it's really important to have that diverse voice across the market too. So very much encouraging that, but building that in your marketing strategy as well. It's not just a standalone function. It's very much, right, how are we going to be seen as the expert in our field? So using thought leadership, using expert opinion as well is very important.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think awards as well is a really big one.
Yeah.
People are always a little bit nervous when I first pitch it, like a personal award to them, like industry expert or something. And it almost feels like you're bragging, but it's really not. You're presenting what you've done in your industry for however many years. And it's, you're not bragging. It's just kind of showcasing what you have done.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the challenges that sometimes we have, especially with companies that we work with that perhaps are on an exit strategy, it's not focusing on one person in particular. So it's kind of utilizing the team's expertise.
Yeah.
Perhaps you've got an operational person, a commercial person, a technical expert. So it's kind of making sure that they all have a voice and they're all talking about their expertise as well.
Yeah, even down to things like in press releases, news content. Who's best to quote in the press release. It doesn't always need to be the one person, the most senior person. It's whoever is most relevant to that story that you're trying to tell, because it is all storytelling at the end of the day.
Are there any risks in being too personal, and how do I avoid crossing that line?
I think it depends what you consider too personal. I guess as long as you're always confident in, whatever you say, there's a chance everyone could hear about it. So you should never say something that you wouldn't be happy with, your boss, your employees, your colleagues finding out. That's what I always kind of think back, before I hit send on something. Like, who could see this? Would I mind them seeing it?
Yeah, and I think at the kind of high level of social media policies, etc., which obviously a lot of businesses have in place to ensure that, there's no conflicting messages, etc. I think it goes back down to being aligned with messaging, communicating with your team and your staff. This is what we stand for. This is what you do need to kind of develop within your own branding as well. But I think it's a very fine balance, because you want to be seen, especially as a business leader, you want to be seen as authentic, you want to be seen as personable, communicate what your values are, but also just always having that in the back of your mind that the company does have its own values too, and how you align those with your business as well.
Yeah, and I do think as well, people do like to see people.
Yeah.
And if you are kind of being true to how you are as a person, then that just is who you are. So, we've had conversations about this before, what's oversharing, what isn't oversharing. And I think it does come down to, again, what you don't mind people knowing.
And a lot of the time we're developing kind of analytics, etc., for our clients. So when we're doing a campaign, whether it's on social media, etc., and we do see a very strong case for that personal profiling and how effective that is for engagement. So there's definitely that argument that people like reading about people, and that personal aspect is very important too, because we are all, we're all human.
Exactly. And we just worked with a client on a campaign around AdPec, and a big part of that was that personal approach. And, the results of that were incredible. We saw like over 1,000% increase on website visitors, and it was purely just from putting people on the front of the campaign. So it does go to show. How can you raise issues in organizations when they don't align with your values, which is a key part of your personal brand?
Okay, so this probably comes down to internal comms, engagement with your team. If you're obviously a business leader, it's kind of being very open and talking about what the values of the company are, making sure that you're all very clear on that first of all, and then creating your kind of company messaging, what your mission is, what your values are, how you're going to communicate those. If they don't align with your personal brand, I think it's very much looking at how you kind of adapt to them as much as possible, without, again, that message of being authentic. You still want to stick to your own personal kind of authenticity and how you kind of want to communicate your own values too, but there has to be some alignment. So I think being very open, communicating, and also just checking in with your peers and your colleagues regularly to make sure that you are aligning with your own values as well.
And I think it's okay if your values evolve and they don't align anymore. Like, that is okay. Some people do just kind of outgrow where they are, and that's not a bad thing. And people change and they develop. So I think just having that self-awareness, but also feeling comfortable enough to voice those concerns. I think that's always something you have to consider as well. Is it a good fit for you? How do you come back from something that negatively impacts your brand?
So I think traditionally over the last 20, 25 years, the media landscape's changed dramatically. So crisis comms used to very much be something that you could plan ahead for. Obviously, you have your messaging, etc. If the worst does happen. However, now with the digital age, we're obviously having to react to things very quickly, and we deal with all sorts of situations that you could never necessarily plan for. Some of them are down to maybe a personal negative kind of experience, and that again, it's then having to adapt your company crisis comms policy to that. I think it's really important to have that support within the industry, so making sure that you are able to respond to something negative as quickly as possible, making sure that you plan for the worst case scenario, and ensuring that you've got kind of some templates, etc., available should the worst happen. And I think having that really good communication with your advisor is important. So relationships again, you can't control, everything that everybody does, but if you've had a lot of engagement with your team, they understand, what the process is, etc. I think that's first part of making sure that, you do handle a crisis effectively too.
Yeah, and I think as hard as it would be is to not panic. You don't need to react immediately in the sense of, go online and post your own statement before you've kind of had time to think about what it is that you're saying, how you want to present that situation. And, working with that third party is so important because it's that outside perspective. When it's happening to you, it's so hard to get out of that bubble almost. So if you've got that outside perspective, you can kind of see how things might be taken, and then you won't make it worse accidentally. And
that's the thing, we're constantly monitoring media, we're always constantly monitoring industry news, and I think understanding what, the media does and how it reacts as well is very important. So having that expertise on board is definitely a positive thing. Can AI be trusted to deliver authenticity?
So over the last couple of years, we've seen a real increase in the demand for AI. We've had clients come to us and say, look what I've done. And they've written something. It's not always terrible. You can't trust a robot essentially to know how you communicate as a company, as a person. Authenticity is so important. And unless you've kind of worked with someone for quite a while, it's hard to get that tone of voice. We find that when we have new clients, we do a lot of work to understand how they want to communicate, how they already speak. And if you're just kind of putting in a prompt to an AI generator, it's hard to get that balance. On the flip side, there definitely are positives. We're definitely seeing that across the industry. So, you've got, it helps with kind of streamlining things, you can kind of automate operations, things like that. So there's a place for it in the industry, but I think it's finding that balance of how you use it.
And I think, again, it's never going to capture that personal voice and that personal storytelling that is so important when we talk about being authentic with your personal brand.
Yes.
So as much as there is a place for it, it will never replace that side of things as well.
No, and I think you can also spot it a mile off in some cases.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's certain things, it's almost like it has its own tone of voice, which is quite interesting. But yeah, you can definitely tell. There's times where we've seen something pop up and we're like, oh, that's definitely generated by something, not a person anyway.
Yeah.